Okay, well, I'm very excited to be here. I'm very grateful that you have welcomed a non-conlanger, I am a non-conlanger, to your conference. I'm happy to have been able to facilitate it through the Literary Arts program. And I'm also glad that there's I have a couple of students who have been coming in and out, one colleague, and that's also I'm very happy about that. I'm not a conlanger, but I do consider myself to be somebody who, I sometimes call myself a literal artist. My background is I'm trained as what used to be called a sinologist, which is a little bit of an embarrassing term, a little bit orientalist. So I did a university undergraduate degree in language and civilization in China, which is as insane as anything that you might do with conlanging, that's for sure. So I know a little bit of Chinese, and I fancy myself, as I may say in some of the stuff I'll read, as a bit of a philosopher of language. I think I'm a bit more post-structuralist than you guys are. You know, you sometimes come across to me as being very much like very schooled in structural linguistics, but you still sometimes seem to see script systems as being subordinate to spoken language, which they needn't necessarily be. Whereas my view is more that they're just language practices. There are symbolic practices, some of which are languages, and those languages can be materially manifest in a whole variety of forms. In fact, they could be manifest in any way that they could be manifest. So, and I'm going to be speaking about something very specific, which is, and it'll be interesting to you because this guy, Xu Bing is an art star. He's a MacArthur Fellow. He got a MacArthur grant in 1999. And he made himself famous by producing an unreadable Chinese book. So insofar as this is will be a technical talk, and I'm going to be extemporizing to a certain extent, I'm going to read from this book, which I've just sort of put together, which is just about this book. I'll talk about orthography to a certain extent. Because this was sort of an exercise in orthography. If it's an exercise in anything, from your point of view. But it still causes a major sensation in the art world, for a reason which you'll have to think about that. So this guy turned himself into a cultural star, international cultural star, by creating not a language, just an unreadable script. But he contextualized it in a very interesting way. And I'm gonna again, this it won't be really a talk, it'll be very hybrid. I'm gonna read from the essay I wrote for this book. This book is called Passages in the Making of a Book. And I've always wanted to write about this work, A Book from the Sky, which is its normal English name. Because I'm now hired by Brown University as a visiting professor for 5 years, running in digital media. This is not about digital media, by the way. Nothing to do with digital media. This is a different hat. I felt that I should write about it in a literary way, right? So I wrote this essay, which is sort of scholarly essay, but it's also narrative, and it's a bit Borgesian. Well, that's what I would like it to be. So I'm going to read from it in part, and then I'll talk when I think it's interesting to talk. The exhibits here, by the way, which I'll put back into the chapel, there's an original print by the artist of a thing he calls My Book, which I'll explain later. There's this cloth which he had printed, which has the I haven't worked out whether it's the full character set, but it's the character set from this what you're seeing here. And there's another thing which is very interesting, especially from the orthographic point of view, if that's the right word, his square word calligraphy, which I do recommend you look at because it's right up your alley. And there's also this book. I have a couple of copies of this book. Because it's published by an antiquarian bookseller in London, it's very expensive. I will sell it to you. If you want a copy, I only have 3, and I'm only prepared to sell 2 of those. If you want a copy, you'll have to pay me $60 for it. And that's cost price. Okay, so this is a book from the sky in its installation form. That's what you see when, as a Western art junkie, you go into the National Gallery of Canada, in this case, in Ottawa in 1998, and you see this, right? And you would probably try and consume this in a very different way to how the average viewer would. But you just see something that is what? Basically beautiful. And it's books. You probably get that it's books. And you probably get that you can't read them. But but you may not have been told that you can't read them. I'm just saying something different. Anyway. It was spring 1997 when my then employer, a prominent antiquarian and specialist bookseller, now a major collector of Chinese books and printing, handed me a notice concerning his unreadable book. When I said, I never mentioned the name of the artist in this text. It's always the artist of his book, or his unreadable book. I am unclear about what form this notice took. My best guess was that it was some reproduction of publicity for an exhibition of work by the artist of his books, including his Tianshu, which was held at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London. Since soon afterwards I attended the exhibition, and it was there that I first saw actual copies of his book and experienced this work in its usual art world context, as an installation, carefully composed for strong visual effect in the perplexing but now well-established mode of installation art. It's not an object, it's not a painting or a sculpture or even a book as such. It's a configuration of objects and materials that represent a concept and provide some evidence or record of the development of the concept and the making of its constituent elements. You can't possess it. You either have to find some elaborate way to acquire a personal record of the work, or you have to take part in a process that allows the installation to remove itself into a museum or major gallery, where this representation, beyond an individual's acquisitive capacities, can be preserved for collective curated culture. In a sense, I'm helping you to own the Tianshu by writing this. Of course, a few individuals and legal entities are wealthy and resourceful enough to acquire such installations outright. The going rate for a copy of the book, which is only 4 volumes, is about $75,000. Maybe more, especially after I wrote this. I have been calling Tianshu his unreadable book, but it is impossible to be entirely satisfied with any general designation of this kind. It's a shorthand. The Tianshu is a book as well as an installation. It is unreadable, and the phrase may be allowed to serve its purpose in this narrative. But as is now well known, the properties and methods of Tianshu's unreadability are notable and pertinent to its remarkable and widely acknowledged aesthetic value. It is sometimes cited as the most important late 20th century work of Chinese art. Is it unique in some other senses that have earned it this unique status? Is it uniquely unreadable? How could we ever know whether or not something that we cannot read, literally or metaphorically, is unique? In a sense, every unreadable book must be the same as any other unreadable book, insofar as Tianshu is remarkable or unique or original, even using these terms as they are loosely employed to ascribe value to works of art, then it cannot be unreadable. And yet the unreadability of Tianshu is crucial. I realize now as I write this that along with some of his more readable works, I have been reading and rereading his unreadable books for over 10 years, and that all my other reading and much of my writing has been undertaken in the articulate shadow of the unreadabilities that he inscribes. Why his book? Over my desk hangs the artist's proof of a woodblock print. My print is untitled, but I know that the artist eventually called it my book. The printed area of the black and white image is 42 by 32, so I should skip this. It is set in black letter typeface. The text is unreadable but seems to be based on modern English, from which most of the, to me, readable words are taken. The print depicts a bound bookmark of a ribbon-like material that partly obscures the text near the gutter of the opening's verso. Here is my somewhat hesitant transcription of the visible text on the left-hand side of the opening. Seled one me muben, ui jovenation hasbe, back the fif lichers what cheese at eat bow to suftzat, etc. It seems clear to me that these odd, mis, or non-spellings are based on modern English. So I should show you that earlier. Based on modern English, but it is difficult for me to specify how or why. Is it solely because of the correctly spelled empty or function words? That's what we call them in Chinese, by the way, grammatical parts, because it's an isolated language. There is also the fact that English happens to be my mother's spelling, and it is, I believe, the artist's second written language. Occam's razor tells us that English would be a likely default for any of his alphabetic encounters with other writing. This is supported by the text of his square word calligraphy, which you can look at, which are all, to my knowledge, in English, although this writing system could be equally well applied to any language that now uses the Roman character set. I'm getting ahead of myself. What I mean to say that is even, for example, kolofs, strain, and shila seem to me to be English unreadables. Does this mean that I do in fact read them? Does this page inscribe the artist's other lettered reading of English, where the grammar words are mostly familiar, but full words remain ungraspable babble? Then imagine yourself as the artist. Build a table of correspondences in your own script to bring them to order. Discover in the pages of a lost book that this had been done long before, by you yourself, when you first encountered the other language, when you first wrote your book, the book of your encounter. Right. Now the interesting thing here, I think I'm missing, I seem to be missing the links. Oops, sorry. No, I'm not. The interesting thing is the table. You see, there's a table on the right-hand side, and how that works is that it's a character that gives an approximate sound of the name of the letter, not the letter. Nothing phonemic about this at all. Just so it's actually I, and the next one is B, and the next one is C, and the next one is D. Right? So that's what the character. If you pronounce the characters, that's what you get. So it's a very simple code, right? For systems of writing with a relatively small number of distinct elements, a table like this provides a simple cipher capable of transcribing any arrangement of the original elements. Here, the now familiar and standard 26 Roman letters. Thus, it wasn't at the time the book appears to have been written, by the way. Thus, ignoring things like punctuation, case, and the occasional extra alphabetic glyph, the entire corpus of Roman alphabetic literature could now be transcribed using these Chinese characters. According to the table, and then I transcribed Tianshu and also my book into that system. In fact, as Bishop Wilkins, who's another person in my narrative, Bishop John Wilkins, you guys know that person? I got the facsimile of the book here. He wrote, this is in Mercury, his messenger, whatever is capable of a competent difference, perceptible to any sense, may be a sufficient means whereby to express the cogitations. A great quote. Also, he was notable to me in that he has binary systems. He shows that you can do all symbolic practice in binary. I guess at a pretty early stage. Since the advent of programmable machines and the swift, ultimately totalizing transcription of the human literary archive into encoded data scrolls, it has been possible to make such transcriptions for purely aesthetic effect. This is, by the way, this is another instantation. He called it ABC. So those are the same characters, but then just done as what are they called? Sorts, as in for printmaking, and then displayed in a gallery. So if you do printing technology in a gallery, how good it looks. Right. This is Caleb Lawson's The Complete Works of W.S. W.S. is William Shakespeare. Right. He's down the hill. He's a RISD. As a recent example, there is The Complete Works of W.S. by a young artist doing graduate study at an art school close to my university, in which the letters of Shakespeare's written corpus are transcribed into the colored dots, now more often referred to as pixels or picture elements, of a large print, the order and color of the dots being determined through a correspondence between the first letter of a dot's color name in English, not any of your languages, and the letter from Shakespeare that the dot transcribes. Got that? Yeah. Not particularly difficult. So I did this into Xu Bing's system. I hope this works. You really have to. Okay, so remember the table in my book? So if you go through it, you'll see that the T corresponds to a character which is said as T. The H's corresponds to two characters which are pronounced roughly Aich, right? And the E for this is the first word at the top left, translates into a character which is pronounced E, right? And so just using a computer program, it was possible to do exactly the same thing as Larson did, but to do it in this bizarre form of transcription. It's ridiculous, huh? The young artist Shakespeare is a simple cipher, and it can be taken in with a single glance. It is unreadable, but it's easy for me to convince myself that given a programmable machine, I could read it back into the verses of the bard. What interests me is the symbolic linking of literal identities to parts of larger symbolic and material structures and assemblages. The letter is linked by acrostics to the larger and more resonant name of a color, a word, and then in the printed work to the matter of light and color itself, reflected back into my eyes by the tiny dots. If now I took the table from my book and printed all the necessary character combinations to spell out the works of W.S., I would produce a similar object for which I might claim a certain aesthetic. But its encounter with language would be different and would necessarily cut across cultures. This is crucial, by the way, if you're trying to sort of think about why he is selling his book for $75,000 and you guys aren't. The two great cultures of writing on the planet, in a manner that corresponds with the typical engagement of all his books and of much of the artist's work as a whole. The identities underlying the cipher are different to those that the younger artist highlights. And in fact, although literal, they are relatively complex as well as transcultural. Every letter has a name, a dictionary entry. It is also a word that can be pronounced in a manner that is not necessarily close to that, the way the letter may typically be sounded in reading. It's nice to be able to read this to a group like this, where I know that you know exactly what I mean. W is the extreme example. It is these pronunciations of the letter names that map my book's characters, or rather to only one aspect of each character, or set of characters as a whole, their pronunciation in modern Mandarin. But the rest of the character's symbolic structure becomes redundant, insignificant. But these differences, these systems of potential significant relationship to the rest of written Chinese are not thereby erased. The characters' differences and the meanings that they might generate are embedded redundantly in the text and hyper-repetitively, since only 30 of several thousand extant Chinese characters are used in the cipher. My book's Complete Works of W.S., that's this, is an aesthetic celebration of mistranscription, and in the cross-cultural context, mistranslation or non-translation, a grotesque mistranslation of W.S. into Chinese. But this sense of meaningless excess and repetition depends on our awareness and sensitivity to those larger symbolic structures within which our messages are buried. No one is annoyed or oppressed by the frequent repetition of E in written English. The E's in the other letters are unburied, unhidden. They are here on the surface. They are what they are, aren't they? Oops, I got to switch back. Okay, this is the actual exhibition I went to in 1997. And I'm going to read a little bit more from the book. Somebody better give me an idea of how hard I'm for time. But I am okay. You've given me an hour, which is very generous. I hope this is not too tedious for you. My second picture, I took low-resolution digital images of the exhibition with my Apple camera, the name of which I've even forgotten. And these are actually those images. I'm quite proud that they're the original images, not some high-resolution thing. My second picture brings us to an immediate confrontation with the paradoxes of our readings of the unreadable book. Now, these ideas you might think about in relation to your languages. These began, in fact, with the first impressions recounted in the previous paragraph. There, I read for you, I talked about, in the previous paragraph, I talked about how you look at the books, but they're not your books. They lie on the tape, they lie on the floor differently. I say that they have a pattern which is cardioid, like the top of a heart-shaped wave. Whereas a Western book is more like that, or it's like wings, so we think of it as wings. And so even though you see books, you don't see your books, you see somebody else's books that are different. And so they look prettier and a little bit more foreign. I read for you an aspect of traditional Chinese bookbinding and compared it with that of the West. If you were unfamiliar with this type of binding, then what I did might be seen as an act of translation, one that allowed you to read something from the installation that would otherwise be latent or concealed, or that would remain for you some part of the abstract effect of the installation, a mere rippling of light and form spread out at your feet. For me, this apparent narrative approach has brought home the fact that even in the most immediately apparent aspects of this work, the same structures of differing and shifting cultural readability obtain, especially the superposition that the work assumes between transparency and opacity, old and new, persistent traditional form, and artifice for the sake of artifice. Now, this second picture depicts the image of a young Asian woman entering the Nash Room of the ICA in London for the first time. I gazed back and took a digital photograph of her as she began to read. You may now begin to appreciate how her reading differs profoundly from my reading, and I assume from your own, while also leaving intact the overarching tenor of the installation. Soon we will all be reading our ultimate inability to read, but we will achieve this in very different ways. Unless she was raised in the West, with little or no exposure to Sinocentric literary and material culture, and that would be entirely possible these days, this young woman will be familiar with the way an old Chinese book lies on a flat surface. For you, if you are brought up in the West, it will be different. As we approach the installation with this usually subliminal visual reading of books, book cultures, we encounter a superposition of the type to which I referred above. Any particular reading of this display of the unreadable book openings will be indeterminate until we know the cultural background and experience of the reader. This point appears obvious in this context. It affects immediately visibly palpable when we are presented with the Tianshu installation. It provides broad but powerful support for the effects of cultural predisposition on reading a la reader response criticism. However, while these cultural effects are palpable and crucial for the Tianshu, by contrast, it would be difficult for me to anticipate in any easily expressible sense, assuming you are a Western reader, the characteristics and context of your particular reading of, for example, The Way by Swans. That's the first one in Proust, in an unusual translation. Bizarrely, it can be acceptable for both you and I to say that we have both read Proust's classic text, that we both share a closely related literary experience, even if I have read it in English, and you have read it in your native, Wisconsin? Here, faced with a book from the sky, with his book, we know that we are reading in an entirely different way as compared with the young Asian woman. Let's imagine that she is indeed Chinese from Hong Kong, studying business administration at Brunel University in West London. She has indeed seen a number of old Chinese books during her young life, but not as many as I have, but far more than you, and they are part of her native material culture. She reads contemporary Chinese fluently, though less frequently these days. She knows more or less instantaneously that she cannot read this Chinese, if it is Chinese. She does assume in some sense that it is Chinese. For you, it will be different. You read the words or characters printed in the books on the floor as Chinese, and as such, you know that you cannot read them. You don't know that you can't read them. To know that, you would have to know that they can't be read. And not even the Chinese woman knows this yet. It will take you longer than it takes her to come to this realization. Although not necessarily longer in terms of the temporal duration. Since either of you first encountered his book, you may already have read an explanation of the installation, and may thus already have been informed that the language of the Tianshu is unreadable. But to know this in the way that the Asian woman or I know it, you would have to take the time to learn and be able to read at least some Chinese. Because of my education and interests, my own reading was and is relatively privileged. I can see how and why, in certain clear respects, my reading might differ from that of someone who was raised and educated in a Sino-centric culture. And I can anticipate, with a good chance of success, how my reading and the young Asian woman's will differ from yours, assuming you were not so raised. I can see this in terms of the Tianshu's relation to language as a system of inscription, and also to language as material culture. This is another of his works. We'll just have to take a little rest from the reading. He did a book called Braille Literate, and he did it in two different forms. These were books in Braille written for sighted people, and then he had books written in normal, printed in normal form for blind readers. This is square word calligraphy, and this is the actual book that I have here, which is a manual on how to write square word calligraphy. You'll probably see immediately, especially thanks to the talk yesterday, that it's a way of writing English and arranging the letters into character-like shapes. So it's a little Bo Peep. And that's a classroom. He would set it up as a classroom, so that would make it into an installation. I'm jumping ahead. I'm going to tell you a story now. I love this story, and you might think about, again, I think this relates to some of your experiences. It must have been a few years later, in 2000 or 2001, that I was waiting to collect my youngest daughter in North London primary schoolyard. There was an elderly Chinese gentleman there, who also apparently waiting for a young child, I assumed his grandchild, who was in the same year as my daughter. By his dress, it was clear that the old man was visiting from the Chinese mainland. He was wearing a cotton cap and jacket that reminded me of rural China, although the style had been more or less universal throughout Chinese society. I decided to say hello and attempt a friendly conversation in my reasonable but far from fluent Mandarin. Hello, I said in Putonghua, the common tongue. Where are you from? I addressed him directly, unambiguously. He could see that I was talking to him, but he knew that he couldn't understand me. He pointed to his nose, a traditional Chinese way of indicating oneself, and said in slow, clear, but it's actually not ungrammatical, it's sort of semi-grammatical, Putonghua. I am China. Just as I would say, I English to a cannibal in New Guinea. His sentence is arguably a little less ungrammatical in Chinese. Mandarin was his native dialect. I know you're Chinese, I answered in Chinese. But where in China are you from? He pointed to his nose again and repeated slowly, I am China. I soon gave up. I do know a couple of languages, but I'm no linguist. I suffer from the monolingual inertia of the predominant Anglophone. Nevertheless, I am a literal artist, and I do fancy myself as a comparative grammatologist, as well as something of a linguistic philosopher. As such, I tend to subscribe to Ivan Illich's view of linguistic distinction, or rather indistinction. In the great scheme of human things, modern languages, in quotation marks, are just that, modern. They are recent constructs, as much a function of geopolitics and contingent national boundaries as of anything else, including actual linguistic behavior. In earlier times, and even now, it might be better to think of human beings as speaking, writing, and hearing reading without predetermination of some distinct language that they were or are doing this in. Groups of people have come together and they speak, write, and hear, read until they are doing so together in a way that literally makes sense to them and makes sense for them. This is one way of thinking through certain consequences of the fact that so many people who may be deemed illiterate or uneducated nevertheless have remarkable mastery of several languages in their day-to-day lives, far beyond the capabilities of most predominant Anglophones. Such people simply kept talking to many other people until in different times and places they understood one another, while I think that film was sort of about that. While we, the predominant Anglophones, continue to concentrate on a particular privileged register, I hate this echo, of the now global English, in order to make ourselves understood to a particularly recalcitrant but extremely powerful constituency. At any high-level academic, economic, political, cultural conference on the planet, there will be English. Even at places and times where other languages are prevalent or more fluently practiced by those meeting together, if even one of those present does not yet speak one of the other non-English conlangs at play, well then, they are liable to apologize for the fact that they have become the cause of English. The reason for the meeting to revert to the global common interlocutor, or Esperanto. Okay, I'm now going to extemporize. Unless I can find another interesting paragraph. That's a lot. Because I realize that I haven't really told you how the Tianshu works, the book from the sky. And I think that in the time that left, I should. This, completely out of any sort of coherence in relation to the talk, is one of his later projects, which also relates to things you're doing. He has a project called Book from the Ground, where he collects icons. It's rather like bliss symbolics, but it's a sort of guerrilla bliss symbolics, and he will collect the icons and arrange them into a language of his own, and then he's written a book like he's written a novel, a set of simple sort of autobiographical stories based on this collection of icons. So here is what the book looks like if you take a photograph of the front cover of the first volume. And what the artist did was that he suddenly realized that he wanted to do an unreadable book. This was in I think 1987. So he decided he wanted it to look like the oldest existent with full-on cultural authority Chinese books. Song Dynasty. So we're talking as early as the 10th or 11th century, likely to be a little later. He didn't to a sort of a bibliophile, and I'm a sort of a Chinese bibliophile, he didn't achieve this. His books look later, but he still coded into the book a whole lot of things, trying to make it as early as possible, as authoritative as possible. With that idea in mind, he started to actually get down to it, because he's actually trained as a printmaker. And he started to type these sorts to make the book. And he carved a vocabulary of 4,000 of these types initially. And his rules for doing that were based on a sort of negative orthography. He wanted to produce things that looked like characters, and that had a very sort of sophisticated sort of native understanding of the way characters are constructed. but were not in any dictionaries. And that's basically what it gets down to. They're non-lexical, they're extra-lexical, but they're characters that could be characters. Now, for reasons that you will understand, and was explained, there's no easy mapping between systems of inscriptions to actual language practice when it's vocalized. It's always an incredibly messy relation. And it's bound to be even messier with a script that is morphographic or logographic, or however you want to characterize the Chinese script. You could talk for hours about what its actual relation is. Nonetheless, if you've read your Derrida, you'll find out that you'll see that a practice of inscription it can have multiple cultural references. It works in all sorts of different ways as it works. So if you see metaphors in it, they work. If you don't see metaphors in it, and other people share the seeing of metaphors in it, then that will work. That will give persistence to say a particular symbol. If you see something that gives some indication of sound in the glyph, then that will also work. But as an eminent structural linguistic pointed out in relation to Chinese, the phonetic information in the characters is about 75% useful or less, which is not considered to be very good, even though in English it's nowhere near 100%, as we know. So this is the title page of the book, and you can see that it looks like a proper title page. He says in an essay that he picked these characters, the three characters in the center, because they look more like other characters. The way it works in terms of relationship to other types of how do you say the adjective? Orthographic practices are that element, for instance, is instantly recognized. Anybody who knows Chinese as the character for east, right? Which can also appear as an element in other characters. This combination never occurs, right? And this little hat part, that also occurs in many characters. This thing together, I believe, doesn't. I mean, we've got one other phonologist in the room, so I have to be careful what I say. but the part down here does. So it's a real mishmash. And then all he's got to do is he's got to put together characters that look like they could work, and then check the dictionaries to make sure they're not there. So it's that's.
The letter part seems harder.
What? The which part?
Check the dictionary. Checking.
Easier to create characters than make sure they're not real.
Yeah, but if you go through, he actually used one particularly authoritative dictionary. He used a dictionary called the Kangxi Dictionary, named after a later emperor. So he went through the dictionary and sort of, as he went, I imagine, I'm not absolutely sure, but I'm pretty sure that he went through according to stroke count. Dictionaries are most often arranged by stroke count, or a combination of stroke count and elements. Another interesting thing for you for conlangs, or one of the apart from the fact that, and again this is going to be a controversial statement, it's arguable that on the planet there are basically two culture spheres. There's a culture sphere where the system of inscription is basically alphabetic, and a culture sphere where the system is basically whatever the Chinese system is. And that when you say that, I mean, there's a wide variety of possible systems of inscriptions that you could invent for languages. But on our particular planet, the only culture-sustaining systems are those two, which is kind of interesting. So although we don't have a particularly good grasp, that you can say that there is some sort of radical disjuncture. Whereas between the broadly the alphabetic, the cultural differences are there's a bit much more permeability because the system of inscription is fundamentally similar. And where was I? So, and yes, what I wanted to say was that one of the interesting things about Chinese culture is that whereas we have over time evolved a standard order, which is remarkably universal. If you pick up a dictionary, you know how to use it, even if you have no idea what the language is. Because you're going to initially assume, you'll find that there are other extra letters, say you're looking at Swedish or whatever. But it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, blah, 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 right? In Chinese, you have to learn the system for every new reference work. Because it'll be slightly different. Somebody will have mucked up the system or decided that a certain system was better. And that's extraordinary. Imagine a culture where you're not really sure how the indexing system is working. And how much time do I have left?
About 13.
13? What do you have time for questions? So you see, this, although it just looks like a sort of fancy printing to you, to me, this looks like really fancy printing. I think, my God, this is like Gutenberg. I just found it, this really nice and also curious. And then I learned that it's movable type. That's also very exciting because that's rare in Chinese, or it isn't. It's rare in the West. The character forms are nice, but they're interesting. They're unusual, a little bit unusual. It's beautifully designed, and it has all these features. It has the column arrangement and the bulleted items, and actually there's something you can read. You can probably figure out, this is the numbering system. These are the page numbers. So this is 1. And unfortunately these are a bit obscure. But what happens is that the number of strokes builds up into this character inside that box until it reaches 10. So this is something like, it's either 30 or 40, I can't quite read it. So it's 3 10s and a 1. Although you can't see the 1. So that'll be 31 or 41. So, and the existence of those characters mean that the whole thing becomes coherent. So although the characters themselves are unreadable, as a cultural object, as a material cultural object, the thing is coherent. Certain characters get repeated, like that, right? Which, although it's not a character, I know that it means preface, right? And it becomes obvious that it means preface because it always appears in the preface position. So the book is not entirely unreadable. And then of course I'm reading the elements of design because I know that the top part are notes, and they're recognized as a particular type of notes which are common in East Asian culture, in Chinese culture. Now, let's see, I was going to give you a test to find the right sort of page. That's obviously a dictionary, right? Well, that's a word list. In fact, it's a pronunciation guide. Although there is no pronunciation. And then this is a dictionary. A character dictionary. And then this is part of I think that's the end of the character dictionary, where you get the characters with the most strokes. So you see how many that has? 36 it says. So you see, you get 3, 10, and then if you counted the strokes of the characters in there, it would be 6. I'm not going to have time to get to what I want to do. I don't have a good page, but can anyone, if you look at these 2 columns, imagine that's the beginning. It's actually the beginning of a preface. But can anybody say why it can't possibly be a representation of a likely or natural language? Although you guys are going to say that it's perfectly possible. Anybody?
Is it low on function words?
Yeah, it
doesn't have much repetition at all.
It has no repetition at all. He did the one thing that he didn't do that I would definitely have done if I was him was I would have had a pseudo representation of something that would look as if it might have a grammar, but they didn't. Yeah,
You could be. There are repetition of elements.
yeah, that's right. That's right.
Individual pieces within each character are repeated.
Absolutely.
So it very well could be, but the character at that point would have to mean something totally different than an idea.
But then, from the Chinese point of view, it wouldn't be Chinese. It would definitely be some other language. But that's a very good point. So if it was a properly two-dimensional or multi-dimensional system, where the repeated elements could somehow encode the grammar, then yes, you might be able to write a pseudo language out of it.
It's not common, but there's at least one repetition. The fourth from the top repeats at the fifth
You mean this
from
one?
the bottom. No, on the second column from the left.
Yeah.
The fourth from the top is the same as fifth from the bottom of the same column.
This one?
One up.
So this?
Yeah,
Kind of little X.
Same as what?
is the same as fifth from the bottom. To the right of that one.
To the
Next
right.
one over. Yeah, that.
That?
Yeah.
You think that's the same as?
No.
No, it's not, there's a roof on one.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
No, I think
Yeah, you're right.
The strike.
No, this is different.
Yeah, it's,
Right.
yeah.
It would be very, if anybody ever finds one, let me know, because my assumption was that you only had 4,000, that's enough. And then when you're composing a page to actually print it out, you don't want any repetitions, because it's a lot of extra work.
I'm somewhat familiar with Chinese, not as much as you most likely are. However, the title page, so much of it was so close to words I knew that it almost seemed as if he meant to confuse you.
No, it is obviously meant to confuse you. It's you're meant to think, this is Chinese, but I can't read it.
Like as a work of art, it just seemed like the emotion he was trying to evince was just utter confusion and chaos.
But it's not the same. It's not the same as say Dada or nonsense writing or glossolalia. It's different because it's a huge statement about culture and material culture and the nature of languages. It's not saying read this and you'll enjoy it. It's just sort of throwing it in your face. And just very, very quickly at the end, and then any questions. I wanted to translate it, obviously. And I decided to translate it in terms of Bishop Wilkins, to use his book as the model, and then to make an unreadable alphabet.
Yes.
And then, which is very hard, which is relatively hard, whereas he has a lot of scope, because there's obviously huge numbers of differences when you're trying to choose your characters that are not in any dictionaries. To choose letter forms that have not been, used anywhere to your knowledge on the planet or by any conlangers. That would be like significant. That would be a significant challenge. And I sort of still like to do it because you have to make a small symbol set, but it has to be of symbols that haven't been used yet. That would be hard.
Maybe impossible.
Okay. We own that book in Rochester, University of Rochester. We own a copy of that.
It's not that rare a book,
No.
but I mean, it's a lovely book. It really is a lovely book. The facsimile is here if anybody wants to follow it again. So I don't know which order. I've lost track. There's no chairperson. So let's start here.
Okay. A few things. First, are you familiar with the Codex Serafinianus by Luigi?
Yeah. Not entirely familiar.
It's over there.
I know, I've seen David's.
Right. Just a throwaway, somewhere in the middle when he discusses language, there's a very interesting representation of Rosetta's Stone where he translates his unreadable script into two other unreadable scripts.
Right.
But, so one thing I'm wondering about this, comparing this to Luigi Serafini's book, let's just say, since it was another unreadable book that was created, he created a script, shall we say. It wasn't supposed to look like anything else, though it shares features with other scripts. And then the book had sort of a larger purpose. But at the same time, the creation of the script was something unique. Here it seems like what he's done is try to produce characters that might have been Chinese characters, say, and they just happen not to have been, right? Isn't that a bit more like what Vladimir Nabokov did with his butterfly, where I think he actually created a butterfly that very well could have been a real butterfly. It just happened not to have been. And it's something that is appreciated by biologists, I would say, and perhaps his drawing, somebody who's appreciative of drawings might appreciate it. And fans of Nabokov, they really like looking at this thing. But aside from that, it doesn't really serve.
No, it's not the same. I mean, the process is similar, but the process is far easier. There's no in the terms, if you think of the way that he would have generated the characters, there's no particular connoisseurship there. Right? It's not like there's a connoisseurship of Chinese characters and you're trying to produce a whole lot of very beautiful ones, or to be that you're supposed to be impressed because he's produced a character that's not legible. And the sort of the cultural inclination of the projects also seem to me to be very different. He's this artist Xu Bing. He's interested in absolute cultural unreadability and absolute cultural transparency. And then laterally, because he comes to the West, he becomes about real transparency. His orthography for his square word calligraphy. That's a sort of bizarre hybrid that we could all take it up. We could use it tomorrow for English, and then we'd look like we were Chinese, and there would be this sort of commonality would be generated that would then we'd just be doing English. So if you're trying to judge what's happening culturally, sort of as cultural practice, it's very different to what Nabokov did. That's how I would see it. And we can argue over how important it is, or how interesting it is, or whether it deserves what it gets. But it's not quite the same. So where are we? Somebody help me with this slide.
Yeah. Just a comment. This reminds me of some interpretations of the Voyager manuscript. Some people who believe that it was not intended to be translated. I'm sure you're familiar with it. That it's this kind of artifice.
Voyage manuscript.
Yeah, I'm not actually that familiar with it, except as an idea.
It's a.
What is the name?
It's a manuscript, I believe, from medieval Europe, written in unknown script, unknown language. There have been many attempts to translate it, many analyses done of it, and some finally come to the conclusion that it was probably something like this, where it was never intended to actually be translated or understood.
And it's accompanied by the most bizarre
Drawings.
illustrations and
Yeah.
drawings.
What's the name?
The other thing with the Codex Seraphinianus, and also something in relation to conlines, is that they also are often culture creation projects. So they imagine a culture. So although and my understanding of it, what I've seen of it and what I've read about it, is that it's supposed to be not decipherable, right? But it indicates a culture that is sort of decipherable. Or at least you can enjoy the culture. You can look at the pictures and you can see what's going on culturally. So it's a little bit different from the Xu Bing project, where he's talking about his own culture and its relation to the culture of the West, which are us. That's us. He's talking to us.
I think we're out.
Time's up, by the way, but I don't know what I should do about it.
I would say we'll talk more later.
Yeah.
So tightly scheduled. My apologies.
Okay.